We're in the southern part of France, in the area of Provence. And the area of Provence has this extraordinary river, the Rhone River, the important water highway that dated back to the Greco-Roman period. And the Rhone River separated France, the majority of France at least, from the Mediterranean trade circuits of the southern part of much of Europe. And so in this region of Provence, there is a jewel of a city named Avignon. And Avignon has a number of features to it that are just extraordinary for modern tourists. It has, for example, the Pont d'Avignon, the bridge that today goes to nowhere. This bridge was the main artery that allowed France to cross over the Rhone River and to make its way into the Mediterranean world. And the story of this bridge is really from legend. There was, we were told, a shepherd boy who was visited by the Virgin and was told that a bridge needed to cross the Rhone River at this point. And the shepherd boy told the city councilman that they needed to build a bridge and that he had seen a vision. And they scoffed. And showing his loyalty to the Virgin, the boy then picked up a massive stone, larger than multiple men could even pick up. And he placed it as the first lodestone for the bridge itself. And as a result, the city acquiesced and they decided to build a bridge. And the bridge was quite spectacular in its day. It had 22 spans or arches that crossed the river. And this bridge was the only artery into the Mediterranean world. And the importance of this bridge, to cross over it into Avignon and then down into the Mediterranean world, meant that the city of Avignon was a powerhouse in the trade sectors of Europe. The tolls that you could charge for merchants crossing the bridge or for tourists making their way to Rome made the city the crown jewel for the House of Anjou, the noble house that laid claim to the city for centuries. Other features of the city are quite spectacular as well. The city walls you could still see today. In fact, the walls around Avignon are the largest and the most complete single wall structure left today in all of Europe, the rest either having been lost during wars or having been torn down for the stone to make other things or to build other castles. But the crown jewel of Avignon is the palace. It is one of the most important and one of the most elaborate palaces ever built during the Middle Ages. And this palace, the Avignon Palace, was the seat for a period of about 70 years for the papacy itself. The papacy, in other words, moved from Rome and resided permanently, it seemed at the time, in the city of Avignon in southern France. And this period of time has been known ever since as the Avignon Papacy. It was a time when the Pope and the entirety of the Christian courts, the cardinals, and all of the entourage that surrounded the medieval Pope lived and conducted their business in France itself. The Avignon Papacy is a period of time in which many historians and many scholars of the Middle Ages love to poke a little fun at. It's a period of time in which the papacy itself appears to be humbled. For these 70 years that the papacy is in Avignon, there are many who would claim that the papacy is merely an extension of the French government, that Christ's vicar on earth in the Middle Ages had now been reduced to a pawn for a powerful king of Europe. But as we'll see, much of that story is a bit overdrawn, and in fact what is happening in the Avignon papacy is both a mixture of positive forces and negative forces that are drawing the Middle Ages into a series of calamitous events that will bring low not only the papacy, but a number of other countries as well. And the story begins in 1294, when Celestine V is appointed Pope. Now, Celestine was not a scholar and he was not a diplomat. He was not a man to make the papacy more about the power of the papacy in Europe. Celestine, over the years, has been hailed as a monkish, spiritual man. He was more concerned with his own personal sanctity and with living a devout and holy life. And it seems that the papacy was not a good fit for Celestine. In fact, very quickly he decided that he didn't like it. And so just 5 months after becoming pope, Celestine issued a decree stating that it was possible for a pope to resign from his office. And then he immediately did this, and he resigned and stepped down and went back to being just a monk. And he remarked on the way out that it was impossible for someone to be both pope and good at the same time. Celestine's successor was Boniface VIII. And Boniface VIII is a pope that people love to hate. He is considered one of the more colorful and intriguing and devious popes to ever hold the office. And Boniface didn't seem to care much for the fact that Celestine had stepped down from the office and had issued this parting remark about the moral sanctity of those who are popes. And there were rumors, in fact, that Boniface himself had actually pressured and cajoled Celestine to go ahead and step down. And so Boniface, now rising to the throne, appeared to have risen to the papacy in less than ideal circumstances. And so Boniface imprisoned Celestine on suspicion of heresy, and Celestine therefore died under house arrest. And Boniface set about to engage in a number of political crises that were beginning to erupt in Europe. The first that he gets involved with are a series of struggles in the city and the Republic of Florence. And by engaging with the politics of Florence, Boniface ends up squaring off with a young poet and scholar by the name of Dante. And the turmoil around Florence itself doesn't need to concern us now, but what ends up happening is Dante ends up fleeing Florence, being on the wrong side of the struggle, and he ends up in Rome, and Boniface encourages Dante to remain in Rome. And so when Dante is accused in Florence of treason and of suspicion for being against the Florentine state, Dante is actually in Rome and unable to defend himself in Florence. And so the city of Florence permanently banishes Dante and does not allow him to return to the city of Florence. And that ruling by the city of Florence, the banishment of Dante, was only finally rescinded in the year 2008, when the city of Florence, not a moment too soon, decides to go ahead and welcome Dante back into the city's arms. And as a result, Dante's Inferno and Dante's trilogy, the wonderful trilogy of the Inferno and Purgatorio, and then finally his Image of Heaven, should really be seen both as literature and as political commentary. In fact, one of the great paintings of Dante, where he is holding up the Inferno itself, in the backdrop to this, the painter has very shrewdly put the city of Florence, the Duomo, the famous cathedral of Florence itself. But Dante was none too pleased that Boniface had intervened in Florentine politics, and not only that, but his intervention had caused Dante to receive banishment. And so, very famously, Dante, in his Inferno, when he gets to the 8th circle of hell, there he places Boniface as one of those who have received amongst the worst punishments possible. And so for most of the leaders of Europe, Boniface was not a pope to be trifled with. That is, of course, unless you were a strong monarch like the current French king, Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair. Now, at this time, just as Boniface is starting to come into his own as the new pope, there are increased tensions between England and France that are beginning to boil and churn, and that will eventually lead in 1337 to the start of the 100 Years' War. Now, we'll cover the 100 Years' War in a later lecture, but right now we need to understand that England and France are beginning to tussle over dynastic claims, in particular dynastic claims to the country and to the regions of Aquitaine. And Philip IV of France is one of the more important and powerful kings in the Middle Ages. He rules France with an iron fist, and he knows his mind. He knows what he wants from his country. And when he gets set on a mission, Philip is not one to be turned back, particularly not by a pope who decides to intervene in his own personal political affairs. And the struggle between Boniface and Philip begins with the issue of taxation. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 had decreed that kings, if they were going on a crusade, if they were raising money for a crusade, had the right to tax the clergy, had the right to tax the churches at least, in their own realms. And Philip sees in this a bit of a leverage point where he can begin to leverage tax monies from the wealthy church in France to begin to increase his coffers not in this case for a crusade to the Holy Land, but rather to increase his coffers for the sake of his future struggles with the nation of England. And so Philip does this. He begins to tax the French church. And this sets Boniface off. And so in 1296, Boniface issues Clericos Laicos, a decree in which he claims that the papacy alone has the right to leverage taxes on the church itself. And he condemns Philip IV's decision to tax the French church for his own purposes. This is a shot across the bow, in other words. And Boniface is in the rights here. According to the laws of the day, Philip truly had no right to do this. But Philip believed that it was the money from his country, and that the church in his country needed to support French domination and French interests in the area of Aquitaine. And therefore, he felt it was within his rights to tax the church for this reason. And so Boniface's decree sets Philip off, and he imposes an embargo on all trade and on all revenues that were going to the papacy at that time. Now, this is a big deal. The papacy, of course, always needs the revenues from the wider Church of Europe to come into the papacy in order to support itself. And France being one of the, if not the biggest contributors to the papal monies, therefore, to have an embargo placed on that trade or those taxes, those monies going from France to the papacy, forced Boniface to cave. And so a year later, 1297, Boniface caves and he says, yes, okay, I will allow the French king, Philip, to tax the church for the sake of the future wars, the wars that are brewing between France and England. But he says the Pope himself must agree. And in this case, of course, Boniface says, I do agree, so therefore you may tax. As very often happens in politics, though, two shots across the bow from both sides never ends well. It actually incites both to find new ways to try to stick it to the other side. And so very shortly after Boniface caves, and so Philip decides to take the papal legate, that is the papal ambassador, the ambassador from Boniface that is in the French court, there to negotiate with Philip and with all of the French government on behalf of the papacy. Philip takes this legate, a man by the name of Bernard Sassé, and he accuses him of sedition and treason, and he has him arrested. Now this, is a serious offense by Philip. Philip is poking the Pope in the eye on purpose. To arrest the legate on sedition really makes not a great deal of sense. And what seems to be happening here is Philip is accusing the French legate, a man of French by birth, for being treasonous, for backing the interests of Boniface and the papacy itself, and not supporting Philip and his own interests. And so Boniface is incited by this, he is angry by this, and he issues by far my favorite papal decree of all the Middle Ages, Ausculta Fili. And Ausculta Fili, the title literally means, listen, son. And it is the papacy talking to the French king, Philip IV, as if he needs to be brought down a few notches. And again, the title, listen, son, goes on to say that Boniface is now entirely opposed to Philip's provocation of the papacy and of his accusations against the legate there in the French court. And Boniface takes a further step of claiming that he will call a council in Rome to determine if Philip even has the right to rule as king of France in the first place. A bigger threat than anything that Philip can manage. Because if the papacy meets and they decide that Philip is unfit or that he is somehow ineligible to be the French king, and so the holy aura, the divine right of the king of France would then be in jeopardy, and Philip himself could then be removed from office. Philip himself responds in 1302 by calling a very important council, a very important session in France itself. In February of 1302, Philip calls the first meeting of what is called the Estates General. And the Estates General is the first bringing together of France of all of the orders and the levels of society, the three estates. He brings together the clergy of France, he brings together the nobility of France, and in a very interesting move, he brings together the laity of France. In all three levels of society, the three estates, the Estates General, now meeting for the first time, each issue separately their own request that the papacy stand down and not provoke the French king and not threaten to remove his right to rule the French peoples. Boniface is unswayed, and so in October of 1302, he does call a council in Rome, and there Boniface has issued perhaps the most striking document of papal authority ever devised in the Middle Ages. And this document, this decree, is Unum Sanctum. Unum Sanctum is a lightning bolt document. It comes with all of the weight of a council and the Pope behind it, and it decrees that the Pope himself is not just Lord over the spiritual souls and of the lives of all of the Christians of Europe. And it argues that because the soul is superior to the body, so spiritual authority is superior to political authority. And therefore, Unum Sanctum argues that the Pope, and the Pope alone, has the right to decree what happens in European politics itself. Now the papacy is over everything, not just the church, not just the souls of Europeans, but over everything, over the politicians as well. And so Boniface believes he has won his battle with Philip the Fair. And the very next year, 1303, Boniface is on procession with the papal court, and they end up in the city of Avignon, Italy. And there, an army loyal to Philip makes their way into the city, captures Boniface, and puts him in prison. And Boniface is treated horribly. In fact, there's a famous case where Boniface is required by the leaders of the army to rescind Unum Sanctum and all of his threats and his condemnations of Philip. And Boniface replies that he would rather die than do so, at which point Boniface is slapped very hard right across the face, a slap that has been known ever since as the Anagni slap. And Boniface is beaten, he is poorly treated, he is very much under the thumb of this army. And the citizens of the city rally and they rebel and they riot in defense of Boniface in order to free him. And Boniface is freed, but he dies just several months afterwards, almost certainly from the harsh treatment that he received while a prisoner. And so Boniface is essentially killed for his confrontation with Philip. The next pope elected is Benedict XI, and Benedict caves almost entirely to the French forces. He decides, in essence, to ignore Unum Sanctum entirely, and he decrees that Philip is restored and all is well with the French king now and the papacy. Benedict dies just several months afterwards from an unknown illness, and in his place, in 1305, is elected Clement V. Clement was French. Clement had come actually from the southern regions of France. And many see in this that the College of Cardinals, when they select the Pope, have essentially capitulated to the desires of the French king by selecting someone of French birth. And Clement takes the interesting tactic of deciding not to move to Rome after receiving the papacy. He decides, in fact, to just stay in France. Now, there were a number of reasons for this. People have too often read too quickly into this as Clement being ordered to stay or as simply desiring to make the French king happy and so therefore staying in the southern part of France. In fact, Rome at this time was really not a nice place. It certainly wasn't the beautiful city that it is now. The local rulers, the local politicians, the local families in Rome really had descended into a bit of an organized chaos. And Clement decides that he's not going to go subject himself to yet another situation of Italian politics, and so he stays in France. And Clement is faced immediately with another situation where Philip is pushing his interests against the interests of the papacy. Philip had decided by about 1305, 1306, that he had had enough of the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Templar live in some fantasy realm for lots of fictional writers who like to see the Knights Templar as some order of the intelligentsia, of those who are keeping the faith and keeping mystic knowledge that they've learned from the Holy Land to themselves. But the Knights Templar were really a holy order that had been established as a result of the Crusades. And as the crusading states had begun to fall, the Templars had come back to Europe with a great deal of wealth and a great deal of power that they didn't necessarily derive from the kings of Europe. And so from 1307 to 1312, Philip takes on the Knights Templar, and he seeks to discredit them and then therefore to remove their power and, as most kings like to do in this time, to take their monies for himself. And so Philip has all of the Knights Templar in his domains of France arrested almost in a collected effort in one fell swoop to arrest the Knights Templar. Now, this is a staggeringly amazing feat to be able to pull this off in a time before modern communications. But Philip has the Knights Templar arrested, and Clement initially decides that he's going to oppose this, just as Boniface has opposed some of Philip's decisions during his reign. But Clement very quickly caves. Philip and his men put the Knights Templar under torture, and under torture the Knights Templar admit to all kinds of things that they certainly did not do. But under the pain of torture, they caved, and they said yes, that they had done it in order to get the torture to cease. And based on that faulty evidence, Clement V decides to cave, and he therefore supports Philip's crusade against the Templars. From this point on, the papacy is weakened. It does not have the resources or the fortitude to withstand Philip's obsessive desire to seek authority and power within France for himself. By 1309, in fact, the entire papal court has moved from Rome itself to join Clement in the city of Avignon. And it is during this time that the papal palace, the palace at Avignon that you can still go and see today, becomes the center of papal power. Now, the Pope does not at this point own the city of Avignon. He will eventually. And the story of how the papacy comes to own the city outright hinges on the story of the unfortunate Joanna I of Naples. Joanna had married into the Anjou family, who had rights and territories in this region of southern France. And her husband, Louis I, had been murdered. He had actually been locked into his bedroom one night, and he had been strangled to death, and then a rope had been tied around his genitals, and then he'd been thrown out the window, and he had died in a really gruesome scene. And while Joanna was not present, she was nonetheless in the nearby bedroom when this happened, and she did nothing to sound the alarm to bring the troops in, and there were all kinds of claims and suspicions that Joanna, in fact, had had her husband killed. And Louis I's brother was then king of Hungary, and the king mounted an army in the hopes of finding Joanna and putting her to death for the murder of his brother. And so Joanna flees, and in the midst of her fleeing, she finds herself penniless. She has no resources to set up her entourage, to set up the courts that she needed, and the protection that she needed against the king of Hungary who was coming to vindicate his brother. And so in 1345, Joanna sold the city of Avignon to the papacy for a reduced price, let's say, and very quickly that same year, the Pope at the time convened a council and decreed that Joanna was innocent of the charges and absolved her of any of the guilt associated with the death of Louis I. But the Avignon papacy, from 1305 to 1376, is not so much the takeover of the papacy by the French king, as it is just simply the weakening of the papacy itself. Again, there were reasons not to move to Rome in and of itself, even though Rome, by this point in the Middle Ages, was long considered to be the seat of St. Peter and therefore the origins of the power of the papacy itself. But living in southern France was not a bad political move for the papacy. Again, England and France are increasingly moving towards war, and in fact, just about halfway through the Avignon papacy, those clouds of war broke free, and France and England were now at war, and so the papacy had every right to want to be near this. They wanted to be politically near at least one of the kings, France, and certainly near Aquitaine, which was one of the central bones of contention between France and England at this time. Still, given the death of Boniface by a beating and by nearly being executed by an army, and given the quick capitulation by the subsequent popes after Boniface, it is impossible to escape the fact that the papacy has lost some power here, that they have lost some might, that Philip has gained more power, gained more autonomy, gained more control not only over the politics of France, but also over the church itself. And so for 70 years, the papacy resided in southern France, weakened, lacking in some substance, and lacking some of the geographical authority that they derived from being in the city of Rome. But it didn't last forever. In 1376, Gregory decides that he will move the papacy from Avignon back to Rome. Now, this wasn't necessarily controversial. Again, the French king does not believe that he owns the papacy because they live in Avignon. Again, the papacy owns Avignon, and it is just now an alternative home base, an alternative location for the papacy. Still, the lack of authority and the lack of historic cohesion to the papacy being outside of Rome was a serious problem. You have to remember that the Pope isn't just simply the Pope. He's also the Bishop of Rome. That is his bishopric. That is his diocese. So to not be part of Rome, to not be in the city, technically makes the Pope guilty of absenteeism, which by this point in the Middle Ages was a serious offense. The bishop needs to reside in his own diocese. Now, the papacy is granted some leverage on this. The papacy can be in Avignon if he wants to be, some would say. But still, the moral authority, the geographical might of being in Rome was not part of the Avignon papacy. And therefore, 1376, Gregory III decides to move back. Unfortunately, within a year of moving back, the papacy is again weakened. The College of Cardinals that elects a new pope just shortly after the return from Avignon to Rome decides that they do not like the one that they have chosen, and so a number of the cardinals move back to Avignon in 1377, and they elect a second pope. In that election of a second pope, of a counter-pope, sparks the beginning of the Great Papal Schism. And that Papal Schism is what we'll look at in our next lecture.